How do conspiracy theories work?
There seem to be three main things. The first, we know that if people have experienced some terrible event like an assassination or an economic downturn or a lost plane, the human mind tries to find some sort of outlet for the grief or rage or just uncertainty. So there's often a very rapid inclination to try to find some account. The second thing that accounts for the rise of conspiracy theories is social networks. So we know that if people are talking to like-minded others, there can be an account that will go viral just because that's who they're listening to. And even if they have a reality check from some external source, it won't be credible because it can be folded into the conspiracy theory itself. Of course, they would say that, which is why there's a lot of evidence that when there's a correction of a conspiracy theory or something like it, it often amplifies people's belief in the original thought because the denial seems like proof. The third thing, which is noteworthy data about individuals, is that some people are drawn to conspiracy theories a little like moth to flame. So a good predictor of whether people will believe in conspiracy theories is whether they believe in other conspiracy theories. And that effect is so intense that people will believe in logically incompatible conspiracy theories. So if you think Princess Diana was murdered, you're more likely to think that she's still alive. And these can't simultaneously be true.
One of the things that always strikes me about talking to conspiracy theorists is that it's information rich. It isn't ignorance, it isn't people who don't know about something. It's often people who know a hell of a lot more about something than you do.
Completely. So this is why I think conspiracy theories both are important and sometimes intractable in themselves, and also a kind of window onto beliefs generally, because the people who believe conspiracy theories often are well educated, as you say, extremely well informed about the topic at hand, and this is very important, not crazy. So it's easy to dismiss a conspiracy theory that is itself quite wild as the product of some kind of mental problem, but more often than not, it just isn't. And because conspiracy theories are often spreading all over the world, sometimes among people who aren't too friendly to the United States, if we want to figure out what's going on here, in cases where violence is actually possible and certainly distrust, we can't just dismiss it. One of the motivations for some of the work I've been doing is a great paper called the Epistemological Poverty of Extremism. And the basic idea is that if you're an extremist, you often know only a few things from the people you talk to who are themselves extremists. And that is, I think, a brilliant essay because it's connected with political belief generally, where you just listen to people you trust and you don't have ground level knowledge.
You have defined conspiracy theories fairly broadly as a belief that important information has been covered up by people in power. That article, which is sort of about how conspiracy theories are rational for people to believe within the sort of informational networks they're in, I thought that article was sort of fascinatingly scary, and not because of conspiracy theories, because almost everything that you detailed in that article applied perfectly well to political parties, political coalitions, political movements.
One question is what people hear, and another question is what their motivations are. So if you're a political figure and you want to be reelected, you may be profoundly motivated to have a certain belief about the minimum wage or climate change, and that may incline you to believe some things and not others. But even if you didn't have that motivation, it is true that climate change, most of us don't have concrete, detailed sense of the science. We just are trusting people. And if the people we're surrounded by say it's a bunch of nonsense and human beings could not possibly make the planet warmer, then we're just going to believe that. I think in the abstract, it is a kind of disturbing fact that we know a lot of stuff like about our parents and our children and the people we know really well, or about whether our car works. But about political stuff, we don't have that direct knowledge. The hope is that if the democratic process is well functioning, at least things that are way out of line with reality are not going to become policy, or are more often than not going to become the formal view of one or another party. That's the theory, and the theory is often right, but sometimes things that are out of line with reality, they do get believed by one or another party.
Well, so we're in this lengthy period of the political parties pulling further apart, where the Democratic Party used to have people who were liberals and people who were actually ideological conservatives. Strom Thurmond was a Democrat, even when he was very, very, very conservative. And the Republican Party similarly had liberals and it had conservatives. And that was unusual for political parties internationally, but it's how we did it here. That has ended. And in ending, this gets into some research you've done before about if you kind of set an issue loose in a room where there are people of different opinions and in a room where there are people with the same opinions, the room with people of the same opinion will end up with a somewhat more extreme view on the issue. And political parties have become much more like rooms of people with the same opinion than rooms of people with different ones. And so I do somewhat wonder, in terms of that theory being right, how much the structural conditions in which that theory was typically right are changing. And if they are changing in a negative way, whether we think that's kind of a blip or whether we think that's a trend that's going to continue unbroken and get worse.
Let's talk about the phenomenon a little bit. So I did an empirical study a few years ago in Colorado where we got people in conservative Colorado Springs to talk to each other about climate change and same-sex unions and affirmative action, and people in liberal Boulder to do the same thing. And the liberals just talked to the liberals and the conservatives just talked to the conservatives. And it's just as you say that in Colorado Springs, they got much more conservative on all three issues, and they got unified. So there was some differences in Colorado Springs about all three issues. They're kind of squelched as they talk to one another, not only in their public statements, but also in their anonymous private statements after they talked. It's completely symmetrical among liberals. There was some diversity on the three issues, and it was squelched. So that kind of artificial study about like-minded citizens, I think you're quite right, it's happening in government now. So the question for the future, and a lot of it has to do with districting and gerrymandering, is whether the moderating force of diversity within the public can actually help have a moderating effect on both parties. Where moderating, of course, isn't intrinsically good. On some issues, there just is a right answer, it's not moderate. But there are enough issues out there where if you just hear people who think like you do, you're going to end up foolish.
Well, the other thing that should be a force towards getting, quote unquote, the right answer, or at least the answer that you believe is right given the best evidence you have, is governing, right? If you take very, very, very bad evidence on what to do about the economy, and you screw it up very, very, very badly, you are very likely to lose office if you're in power. The place where it really breaks down is when you have issues where the effects will not come on the electoral timetable. I think of climate change as being the key one here. The real damage is still some ways off, and in order to prevent it, hard decisions need to be made now.
I feel a little more optimistic, and I'll say why. I'll say why. When you said the Czech is governing, I kind of had an internal nod, both for the reason you gave and another. The reason you gave is feedback. But there's another thing in governing that I saw close up, which is that there's a kind of ballast provided by both the civil service and American institutions and kind of, for want of a better word, technocracy. So two kind of reality checkers that weren't your point about feedback, that are really very good institutions under Republican and Democratic administrations, are the Council of Economic Advisors and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So neither of those is saying, you know, what does the base think? And neither of those saying, what do people like me think? They're instead staring at evidence. And that does a lot of the same work as the immediate feedback in ensuring reality check.
But you're talking here about checks within the regulatory state or within the executive branch, which I think that's a very, very good point. On the other hand, they don't exist with the same power and potency in Congress right now. Congress is a depleted institution compared to what it once was for all different kinds of reasons. They're much more concerned about what the base thinks. They're much more concerned about getting the opposition or getting the majority party, if they're in the opposition, to lose the next election. And so it seems to me there's a very different way that American government works right now for things that can be done by the executive branch or some independent institution like the Federal Reserve versus things that need to be passed into law. And the way the system is built, a lot of the big things that people think we need to do or that we might need to do, they need to take the form of law.
You're completely right. And whether we're right now in the midst of just a blip brought about by an economic downturn of a terrible sort, plus midterms that are looming, or whether we're in some sort of long-term stasis, I think we just can't know in the middle of it. I would say that there tends to be a natural human inclination to think about the issues on which there is stuckness and impossibility of action, and that may be in some ways an optical illusion, though it's an illuminating one. If you look at what the Republicans and Democrats mutually agree is off the table, it's a lot, and the fact that that's off the table is helpful.
I think it's certainly the case, and I think there's a lot of reason to be glad that politics typically exists between the 40-yard lines. But a lot of that seems to me to be not agreement so much as status quo bias. There is a very deep unwillingness in the American political system to routinely revisit things we've already done. I mean, one of your initiatives in government was trying to begin revisiting regulations that had been on the books, potentially past their useful life cycle.
You're right. It has both in it. Both things are forces. So I'm thinking a little bit in terms of what can be done to modernize, that there's a lot of stuff that goes under the radar, and part of the reason it goes under the radar is that there's a consensus that it's reasonable or good. So there's been not a huge revolution, but a significant change in airports in the last few years, where the Department of Transportation has created this global entry program, and there's TSA pre. Yeah. And there's other stuff that's bigger than that. So fuel economy standards in the U.S. are getting ramped up big time under existing law that has, broadly speaking, Republican and Democratic support, maybe because of status quo bias. So in terms of larger things like immigration reform, that would be an example, or climate change, the intensity, certainly pre-election in the case of immigration reform, and maybe just in this period in the case of climate change, prevents things from being done that would make, the level of change that a lot of people think are desirable. So I'm with you on that. But often the discussion in Washington and actually nationally is about some small segment of grand narratives. So while I was in government, I was kind of amazed by this, that most people would be working on some important project that had no connection with the grand narrative. People are just working on they're cultivating their garden. And it was a garden that would have a big impact, and if you add them all up, it was massively important. And a lot of people, many of whom have no political affiliation, you've never heard of them, they've been working there for 15 years or more, are working 12-hour days to try to make something good happen. And if they do, it might get a headline. It's not going to be part of political discourse, and it's more likely to get no attention, but it's going to help people, maybe save lives, maybe make it easier to open little businesses in Ohio. So that's a reason for optimism.